Let's go to the book. Let us take the case of a transport, which was officially announced to transfer a certain number of prisoners to another camp. But it was fairly safe to guess that its final destination would be the gas chambers. A selection of sick or feeble prisoners incapable of work would be sent to one of the big central camps, which were fitted with gas chambers and crematoriums. The selection process was the signal for a free fight among all the prisoners, or of group against group. All that mattered was that one's own name and that of one's friends were crossed off the list of victims, though everyone knew that for each man saved, another victim had to be found. A definite number of prisoners had to go with each transport. It did not really matter which, since each of them was nothing but a number. On their admission to the camp, all their documents had been taken from them, together with other possessions. Each prisoner, therefore, had an opportunity to claim a fictitious name or profession, and for various reasons many did this. The authorities were interested only in the captives' numbers. These numbers were often tattooed on their skin and also had to be sewn to a certain spot on their trousers, jacket, or coat. Any guard who wanted to make a charge against a prisoner just glanced at his number. And how we dreaded those glances. He never asked for his name. To return to the convoy about to depart, there was neither time nor desire to consider moral or ethical issues. Every man was controlled by one thought only: to keep himself alive for the family waiting for him at home, and to save his friends. With no hesitation, therefore, he would arrange for another prisoner, another number, to take his place in the transport. As I have already mentioned, the process of selecting capos was a negative one. Only the most brutal of the prisoners were chosen for this job. So capos were prisoners, Jewish prisoners, that got selected to help run the prison camp. And capo, I tried to find the etymology of where that came from, and the best or the closest or the thing that made the most sense to me from what I read was they had two words combined together: comrade, police. And in German, those got shortened to capo. So some of these, and you already heard one of those earlier testimonies talking about the Jewish police inside the prisons and how they were just as bad as in many cases as the Germans themselves. Back to the book. But apart from the selection of capos, which was undertaken by the SS, there was a sort of self-selecting process going on the whole time among all the prisoners. On the average, only those prisoners could keep alive who, after years of trekking from camp to camp, had lost all scruples in their fight for existence. They were prepared to use every means, honest and otherwise, even brutal force, theft, and betrayal of friends in order to save themselves. We who have come back, by the aid of many lucky chances or miracles, whatever one may choose to call them, we know the best of us did not return. So there's a dynamic that you don't think of immediately when you think of the concentration camps. Number one, you don't think about the capos, the Jewish police that are forced into this situation. And then the other thing you don't think about is the fact that the people that were going to survive were basically, I'm making a very broad statement, but you know, from what Viktor Frankl's saying here, it was the people that were willing just to do anything to survive, including betraying their friends. And he's saying straight up, we know the best of us did not return. And that is something that you don't think about. And we probably don't think about it because we don't want to think about it. Mm-hmm. Because when you start thinking about what would you do to survive? What would you do to survive? What would I do to survive? And that's a question I don't think a lot of people want to know the answer to. And it's very easy to go through life and never have to answer that question. Talking a little bit now about what life was like in the camp. Back to the book. Somewhere it is said that man cannot exist without sleep for more than a stated number of hours. Quite wrong. I had been convinced that there were certain things I just could not do. I could not sleep without this, or I could not live without that or the other. The first night in Auschwitz, we slept in beds which were constructed in tiers. On each tier, measuring about 6 1/2 to 8 feet, slept 9 men directly on the boards. 2 blankets would be shared by each 9 men. We could, of course, lie only on our sides, crowded and huddled against each other, which had some advantages because of the bitter cold. Though it was forbidden to take shoes up to the bunks, some people did use them secretly as pillows in spite of the fact that they were caked with mud. Otherwise, one's head had to rest on the crook of an almost dislocated arm. And yet sleep came and brought oblivion and relief from the pain for a few hours. The thought of suicide was entertained by nearly everyone, if only for a brief time. It was born of hopelessness of the situation, the constant danger of death looming over us daily and hourly, and the closeness of deaths suffered by many of the others. From personal convictions, which we mentioned later, I made a firm promise on my first evening in the camp that I would not run to the wire. This was a phrase used in camp to describe the most popular method of suicide, touching the electrically charged barbed wire fence. It was not entirely difficult for me to make this decision. There was little point in committing suicide since, for the average inmate, life expectation, calculating objectively and counting all likely chances, was very poor. He could not with any assurance expect to be among the small percentage of men who survived all the selections. The prisoner of Auschwitz, in the first phase of shock, did not fear death. Even the gas chambers lost their horrors for him after the first few days. After all, they spared him the act of committing suicide. And Viktor Frankl was a psychiatrist going into this situation. So that's the view, that's the perspective that he takes throughout this. And he's now been in for a couple days in Auschwitz, and another guy comes in to talk to him, who's another colleague of his. And we're going back to the book. A colleague of mine who had arrived in Auschwitz several weeks previously smuggled himself into our hut. He wanted to calm and comfort us and tell us a few things. He had become so thin that at first we did not recognize him. With a show of good humor and a devil-may-care attitude, he gave us a few hurried tips. Don't be afraid. Don't fear the selections. Dr. M, the SS medical chief, has a soft spot for doctors. But one thing I beg of you, he continued. Shave daily, if at all possible, even if you have to use a piece of glass to do it. Even if you have to give your last piece of bread for it. You will look younger, and the scraping will make your cheeks look ruddier. If you want to stay alive, there is only one way. Look fit for work. If you even limp, because let us say you have a small blister on your heel, and an SS man spots this, he will wave you aside, and the next day you are sure to be gassed. Now his mind and his thoughts, he describes what he would think about Back to the book. My mind still clung to the image of my wife. A thought crossed my mind. I didn't even know if she were still alive. I knew only one thing, which I have learned well by now. Love goes very far beyond the physical person of the beloved. It finds its deepest meaning in his spiritual being, in his inner self. Whether or not he is actually present, whether or not he is still alive at all, ceases somehow to be of importance. I did not know whether my wife was alive and had no means of finding out. During all my prison life, there was no outgoing or incoming mail. But at that moment, it ceased to matter. There was no need for me to know. Nothing could touch the strength of my love, my thoughts, and the image of my beloved. Had I known then that my wife was dead, I think that I still would have given myself undisturbed by that knowledge to the contemplation of her image, and that my mental conversation with her would have been just as vivid and just as satisfying. Set me like a seal upon thy heart. Love is as strong as death. And continuing on, Dr. Frankl talks about images from inside the camp. Standing outside, we saw sinister clouds glowing in the west and the whole sky alive with clouds of ever-changing shapes and colors, from steel blue to blood red. The desolate gray mud huts provided a sharp contrast, while the puddles on the muddy ground reflected the glowing sky. Then, after a few minutes of moving silence, one prisoner said to another, "How beautiful the world could be." And beyond looking for beauty around them, they were able to find humor. And I have people ask me about this from time to time, about humor in combat situations, and isn't it important? And yes, it absolutely is. And you'd think in a concentration camp, even humor would go away. But not true. Back to the book. To discover that there was any semblance of art in a concentration camp must be surprise enough for an outsider. But he may be even more astonished to hear that one could find a sense of humor. Could find a sense of humor there as well. Of course, only the faint trace of one. And then only for a few seconds or minutes. Humor was another of the soul's weapons in the fight for self-preservation. It is well known that humor, more than anything else in the human makeup, can afford an aloofness and an ability to rise above any situation, if only for a few seconds. The attempt to develop a sense of humor and to see things in a humorous light is some kind of trick I learned while mastering the art of living. Yet it is impossible to practice the art of living even in a concentration camp, although suffering is omnipresent. To draw an analogy, a man's suffering is similar to the behavior of gas. If a certain quantity of gas is pumped into an empty chamber, it will fill the chamber completely and evenly, no matter how big the chamber. Thus, suffering completely fills the human soul and conscious mind, no matter whether the suffering is great or little. Therefore, the size of human suffering is absolutely relative. And I think the point that I took away from that was that chamber that can be filled up with suffering, fill it up with some humor as well. Otherwise, that suffering will just fill the whole chamber. It'll fill your whole brain. Back to the book. We were grateful for the smallest of mercies. We were glad when there was time to delouse before going to bed. Although in itself this was no pleasure, as it meant standing naked in an unheated hut where icicles hung from the ceiling. But we were thankful if there was no air raid alarm during this operation and the lights were not switched off. If we could not do the job properly, we were kept awake half the night. So you're at a point in life where you're grateful for being able to stand naked and pick the lice off of your friends before you go to bed so that the lice won't keep you awake at night by chewing at your body. And I talked about how, or he talks about how, it was the person that was going to survive had to be ruthless, basically. Yeah. And here he says, "But it is not for me to pass judgment on those prisoners who put their own people above everyone else. Who can throw a stone at a man who favors his friends under circumstances when, sooner or later, it is a question of life or death? No man should judge unless he asks himself, in absolute honesty, whether in a similar situation he might not have done the same." And here he says, "I mentioned earlier how everything that was not connected with the immediate task of keeping oneself and one's closest friends alive lost its value. Everything was sacrificed to this end. A man's character became involved to the point that he was caught in mental turmoil, which threatened all values he held and threw them into doubt. Under the influence of a world which no longer recognized the value of human life and human dignity, which had robbed man of his will and made him an object to be exterminated, having planned, however, to make full use of him first to the last ounce of his physical resources, under this influence, the personal ego finally suffered a loss of values. If the man in the concentration camp did not struggle against this in a last effort to save his self-respect, he lost the feeling of being an individual, a being with a mind, with inner freedom and personal value. He thought of himself then as only part of an enormous mass of people. His existence descended to the level of animal life. The men were herded, sometimes to one place, then to another, sometimes driven together, then apart, like a flock of sheep without a thought or a will of their own. A small but dangerous pack watched them from all sides, well versed in methods of torture and sadism. They drove the herd incessantly backwards and forwards with shouts, kicks, and blows. And we, the sheep, thought of two things only: how to evade the bad dogs and how to get a little food. He's going to delve into this deeper, this idea of this inner freedom and how hard you had to fight to maintain that, and how easy it was just to roll in and become one of the pack, one of the herd. Back to the book. It is very difficult for an outsider to grasp how very little value was placed on human life in camp. The camp inmate was hardened, but possibly became more conscious of this complete disregard of human existence when a convoy of sick men was arranged. The emaciated bodies of the sick were thrown on two-wheeled carts, which were drawn by prisoners for many miles, often through snowstorms, to the next camp. If one of the sick men had died before the cart left, he was thrown on anyways. The list had to be correct. The list was the only thing that mattered. A man counted only because he had a prison number. One literally became a number. Dead or alive, that was unimportant. The life of a number was completely irrelevant. What stood behind that number and that life mattered even less. The fate, the history, the name of the man. The camp inmate was frightened of making decisions and of taking any sort of initiative whatsoever. This was the result of a strong feeling that fate was one's master and that one must not try to influence it in any way, but instead let it take its own course. In addition, there was a great apathy, which contributed in no small part to the feelings of the prisoner. At times, lightning decisions had to be made, decisions which spelled life or death. The prisoner would have preferred to let fate make the choice for him. And so some of the examples that he brings up in the book on that are, they'd get told, we need people to go to a different camp for rest. And they had no idea. Sometimes it actually was some kind of rest. Sometimes it was some kind of actual medical facility. Sometimes it was just you're going to the gas chambers at another camp, and they had no idea which one it was. And so they got into this mode of they were just going to externally, just whatever was going to happen, that was going to happen. And they go beyond where they're trying in the beginning to like, hey, get me off that list, or I want to be on that list. And they realized that they just were messing with fate. And so they got into a mode of, I'm just going to let things happen, and whatever happens, happens. And they got this feeling of apathy. You can just imagine how that having no control externally of what's happening, how that leads to this apathy of just, I don't care what happens. But number two, how that can then sneak in and start to get control of your inner thoughts and your inner feelings, where you just feel like you don't have control over anything in life, and that's it. And here he talks about apathy some more. The prisoner's apathy was also the result of other factors. Hunger and lack of sleep contributed to it, as they do in normal life also. And to the general irritability, which was another characteristic of the prisoner's mental state. The lack of sleep was partly due to the pestering of vermin which infested the terribly overcrowded huts because of the general lack of hygiene and sanitation. The fact that we had neither nicotine nor caffeine also contributed to the state of apathy and irritability. Besides these physical causes, there were mental ones, in the form of certain complexes. The majority of prisoners suffered from a kind of inferiority complex. We all had once been or had fancied ourselves to be somebody. Now we were treated like complete non-entities. The consciousness of one's inner value is anchored in higher, more spiritual things. It cannot be shaken by camp life. But how many free men, let alone prisoners, possess it?